If you decide to sell your recording studio, decisions need to be made about finance, marketing, logistics, and many other disciplines. These are decisions that business scholars refer to as the make or buy decision. Transaction cost economics is the field in economics that concerns itself with the make or buy decision. In the transaction cost framework, a comparison is made between different modes of organizing a particular transaction. Put simply, if you own a restaurant, you need to decide whether you're going to produce the ingredients yourself or whether you have another mode of organizing these. You could, for example, buy them in a supermarket or form a cooperative with other restaurant owners to jointly produce the ingredients that you need. At the other end of the value chain, you need to decide whether or not you're going to make deliveries yourself or whether you ask a firm to do this for you. When you're moving, you need to decide what you want to do yourself and for what tasks you would like to hire someone else to do this before you. An example of a transaction cost theory application. For example, do you move your stuff yourself or do you hire a company to do this for you? Is that a task that involves a lot of specific investments? Is it a frequent task? Does it involve a lot of uncertainty? Those kind of considerations weigh in when you decide to move your furniture yourself or to leave this to a professional company. When deciding the optimal governance mode, so the best way to organize a particular transaction, economists compare the costs of the different options that are available to them. Traditionally, this is a comparison of the market and the firm, but you can imagine many other intermediate forms of organizing as well, such as the cooperative or different forms of firms. Say, would a family firm be best suited to organize a particular transaction, or is a big multinational enterprise more equipped to perform the task? The costs that we're looking at by making this comparison are not necessarily the production cost, but rather the cost of organizing, which is called the transaction costs, hence transaction cost theory. Transaction costs come from multiple sources, and these sources are determined by the characteristics of the transaction. So let's attend to these two steps. A couple of hours later, I'm done. And the only problem, I don't have a driver's license. Transaction costs include the cost of searching for a particular supplier of the product, deciding what specification you need, the cost of negotiating with that party, and the cost of enforcing the agreements that you made. If you organize ingredient production yourself as a restaurant owner, then you need to hire someone to do this, to grow these ingredients for you. You need to search for the right person and the right ingredients. You need to negotiate a labor contract with that person, and you need to ensure that this person looks after growing the ingredients as you intend him or her to do so. If, in contrast, you purchase these products on the market, you need to find the appropriate supplier of the product. You need to negotiate with that supplier under what conditions you will buy the ingredients, and you will need to check whether what you obtained is what you bargained for. So there are transaction costs resulting from search, negotiation, and enforcement in any kind of mode of organizing, a market, a firm, intermediate forms, and the rational actor would pick the form of organizing that is the cheapest amongst the alternatives. Now, what determines the level of transaction costs for a particular transaction in a particular transaction mode. And there are essentially three factors that are relevant there. The first is complexity. And the more difficult a transaction is, so the more complex the purchase, the more complex the transaction, the more it is costly to decide exactly what you need, to find the supplier that has this exact specification, or to find this employee which has the right skills to do the transaction. That also complicates the negotiation with this supplier or staff member. And if the task is more complex, it is more difficult to supervise the employee or to check afterwards whether you have indeed obtained the product that you negotiated with the supplier. So complexity leads to higher transaction costs in the market, in a firm, in intermediate forms. The more complex a transaction is, the higher the transaction cost. But firms or markets will be differentially able to absorb complexity. So the more complex a transaction is, the easier it is for firms to absorb complexity as compared to markets. For markets, for example, you need to specify everything up front before you conclude the deal. Whereas in a firm, you can hire a staff member and then leave some of the negotiations and specifying until further notice when you've discovered the complexity of the transaction more. So what we'll see is that for complex transactions, the more complex they get, firms are relatively cheaper as compared to the market to coordinate these transactions. Uncertainty is another characteristic, kind of characteristic 1B. So complexity and uncertainty are often mentioned in one go. And this is because uncertainty is more or less the potential of multiple future realities. If the transaction is very uncertain, you don't know what the future will look like, and you need to account for multiple possible realities. So the more uncertain a transaction is, the more complex it is, and that essentially boils down to the same thing. For the second criteria, the second dimension of a transaction, that is asset specificity, let's move back to my selling your home studio example. Asset specificity refers to the extent to which you need to make investments in specific assets for a specific transaction to go through. If the investment is of a lesser value outside the context of this transaction, the investment is considered specific. You can distinguish a couple of forms of asset specificity depending on the asset that you need to invest in. Take as an example coal. If you want to sell coal after you've extracted it from a mine, you need to transport it. Transportation of coal usually takes place through railways. Now, if you invest in a railway system, in tracks and in carriages that take the coal from the mine, then there's limited value in these tracks outside the use of that transaction. Simply put, it is unlikely that the rail connection will be used for commuting or for tourist purposes if the mine should close down. So the railroad is there specifically for this transaction, for getting the coal out of the mine. And it is of lesser value if the mine closes. This is what we call site specificity. It is a form of asset specificity that relates to the location where the investment needs to take place. Because you cannot move the tracks, you are stuck, almost literally so. The second type is physical asset specificity. That refers to particular tools that you need to allow the transaction to go through. For example, in the medical profession, all kinds of specific tools are needed when, for example, you undergo a surgery. Third, second, this is physical asset specificity. Third, we have human asset specificity. That relates to human capital. Sometimes investments are needed in people that are specifically valuable for this transaction. Think about if you want to send a rocket into space, a manned rocket that is, then the astronauts need to be trained to work with the equipment that is actually there. And if the mission into space would not continue, the investment in the human skills, in the human capital of these employees, these people, will be lower. Fourth, you can think of intangible investments. So investments in assets that you cannot touch. Think about brand names or reputations. Think about the risk that a brand identity will be destroyed if a product turns out not to meet the expectations of the consumers. Finally, we have what is called dedicated asset specificity. That is an investment in a tool that is generic in itself. So it is an investment in skills that in themselves are not specific. They're not in any way special. But, and that is the characteristic of dedicated asset specificity, you need it in a quantity that is so big that it becomes special. So think about a pandemic when you suddenly need to vaccinate hundreds of millions of people, then you need an awful lot of people who have the skills to inject vaccines into people's arms. That in itself is a generic skill, but because of the size of the transaction, so the number of people that need to be injected, it becomes an investment that is still of lesser value if the transaction does not go through. So if suddenly we would decide not to vaccinate people, we don't have that much use in thousands of people being able to inject vaccines in people anymore. Okay, so asset specificity refers to investments in assets, locations, tools, people, intangibles, or generic assets on a large scale. And these investments, they have value in the context of the specific transaction that's being considered. If the transaction will not continue, then the investment will be lost to a point. Now, if you know that you're involved in a transaction and someone else needs to make a specific investment in order to make that transaction work, then you can abuse their dependency on the transaction. If you operate a coal mine and you know that there's a rail company that is halfway laying down the tracks to transport the coal out of the mine, then you can start to negotiate the conditions. And you know that the railroad company has an interest in completing the deal, even at a lower price, because the value of the tracks will be considerably lower if they cannot complete the transaction. So asset specificity is a problem because it makes transacting parties susceptible to opportunistic behavior. Since you know that this is the case, if you have to make a specific investment, you will think twice before doing so, before committing to an investment that you know you cannot recuperate if the other party will start to renegotiate the conditions. So you will ask all kinds of warranties, safeguards. You will ask from your counterparty to make commitments to say, okay, if I would withdraw, then I will compensate you with this or that amount. And these negotiations on the investments that need to be made are costly. Hence, the transaction costs go up for transactions that require specific investments. So, Complexity is the first characteristic, asset specificity is the second, and the third is frequency. And there you can have two arguments. The first, which is not the one that's traditionally part of transaction cost economics, is that the more frequent a transaction becomes, the less complex or uncertain it is. So again, you could connect frequency to uncertainty or complexity. What transaction cost theorists argue instead is that the more frequent a transaction is, the more you get locked in with a particular supplier. So if you need many ingredients, or if you move quite frequently, then you become very dependent on this supplier that you've been dealing with for ages. The more often you work with a supplier, the more you get accustomed to each other's working style, and the more costly it becomes to switch to another supplier. Hence, frequent transactions run the risk of opportunistic behavior from the end of the counterparty, just as with asset specificity. In total, these three characteristics, complexity and/or uncertainty, asset specificity, and frequency, determine the level of transaction costs in a specific mode of organizing. And what you will then figure out is that for a particular transaction, it may be cheaper to organize through the market, and for other transactions it may be cheaper to organize this through the firm. And that is why we see businesses doing some things themselves, but other things not. In a follow-up video, I will talk about the comparative statics of this model, as well as the comparative dynamics of the model. Of course, you can ask what happens if in a particular country or industry one characteristic, one dimension is higher than in the other. So what does it matter for organizations, for coordinating in an industry? Does it matter whether a transaction is more specific for one industry as compared to the other? And that would explain why, for example, we see some firms delivering their own products, whereas other firms in other industries decide to leave the delivery of products to other companies. Also, we may wonder what happens over time if changes occur in specificity of assets, in frequency or in complexity. What happens if a firm better learns how a particular transaction works, so the complexity of that transaction reduces? That is the topic of a follow-up video.